All right, thank you for everybody that's joining us today, and welcome to any of our new listeners if this is your first time joining us. This is Curated Conversations with Graha. So we're very excited to have a very, very deep, meaningful, and impactful conversation today. But if you've been listening, Graha is having key conversations that we know can't be tackled alone, and they are built on the pillars in which we operate: care, community, advocacy, research, and education. And together we will deep dive into the minds of healthcare professionals, community leaders, and other influential figures to create engaging conversations that we believe will benefit the Black and Brown communities in which we serve.
Thank you, Kalon. And today we're very excited here at Graha to be celebrating Black History Month. And joining us is Dr. Reverend Carolyn McKinstry, and we just could not think of a better person to be with us today to share her experiences with the civil rights movement. And as you will see when Carolyn starts speaking, she just embodies what we're seeking in our nation and in our country in terms of racial unity, reconciliation, and opportunities for everyone to live a healthy life that enables them to flourish and to also be productive and impactful in our communities. And so we're so excited to have Dr. McKinstry here, and she is my dear friend, and I have been honored to get to know her over the years and to just learn more about her background. And she is a native of Birmingham, Alabama. She came up during the core of the civil rights movement, and as a youth, she saw the racism and injustices that existed in our society. And even as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, she just could not sit idly aside and do nothing when she witnessed daily the injustices that existed in our communities. And so she participated in the youth crusades with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., sat under his feet and his teachings and learned nonviolent protesting, participated in marches as a youth. She was arrested, but it didn't stop her. She kept going because she saw the voices of the youth mattered. So she eagerly participated in that movement. And she was also the youth secretary of the 16th Street Baptist Church and is a survivor of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, where 4 young girls, one age 11, Denise McNair, and the other 3 were 14-year-old children, Cynthia Wesley, Carolyn Robertson, and Addie Collins. And it's important for me to state their names because they are core in the history and their lives mattered and their lives were taken very young. Dr. McKinstry survived that bombing because she was in the bathroom with these 4 girls just before the bombing went off. She was saved because she was a youth secretary and had to go and manage the church office on that day. But she has very personal memories and experiences with the bombing and the death of those 4 young girls, and has dedicated her life to social justice. And she understood the power of her voice and also the power of education. And so she went on and she earned her PhD in divinity and has spoken internationally and nationally all across the world. But what I appreciate most about her is the book that she wrote entitled While the World Watched. And if you have not read that book or purchased that book, I would encourage you guys to purchase it and just learn more about the civil rights movement and the role that she has played in it. And with that, I'd also like to thank the staff who are managing this podcast and our sponsors, Corewell Health, Mercantile Bank, Meyer Corporation, and Genentech for sponsoring our Black History Month program. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And there's so much more to her biography and her story, but I'm eager for her to share it with us today.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate your beautiful introduction.
So we're very excited about today's conversation. So Dr. McKinstry, we love to start at the very beginning. We love to hear more about your early life in Birmingham, what that experience was like, and then we'll kind of transition from there.
So I was born in a little place about 50 miles from Birmingham. It's called Clanton. And when I was 2 years old, my parents found jobs in Birmingham. Both of my parents were teachers. My mother taught 4th grade, retired with 37 years of teaching. And my father taught physics and chemistry in high school. And he also retired with 37 years of teaching. Of course, they're both deceased now, but they were looking for something better for themselves and for their children. There were 6 of us. There were 4 boys and 2 girls. And I'm in the middle, 2 boys older, myself, 2 boys younger, and then my sister. One of the things that you will observe, and what I get a lot of questions about in the book, is my father, because I talk about how strict he was, how very focused he was on making sure that we were the best we could be, and that when we left home, we were prepared to take care of ourselves. So it was a fun life with that many children in the house, but there came a lot of responsibilities with that. Of course, always the very close gaze of my father. If I can give you an example of what I'm speaking of, when we entered high school, whenever one of us entered high school, if we took the courses of chemistry or physics, my father would then require that we take his tests at home. He taught in a different school than we attended. And he said, when we sort of lamented not wanting to do that, he would say, well, it's no problem, is it? You have an A on your report card. We're in different schools, but an A at your school should be an A at my school as well, right? And most of the time, his tests were a bit more challenging. He had a master's in physics.
Oh, wow.
And his tests were a bit more challenging than what we were receiving at school. And so if we didn't pass his test to his satisfaction, it meant additional work, in addition to what you were getting from the school anyway.
Already in high school, you're already getting
right.
Coming
That's
home
right. So
backpack full of work. And you got one handful of your dad's work as well.
But you have to know that I have very deep appreciation for him now and for all that he did for all of us. He created a type of conscientiousness that's very difficult to do, I think, with children. And maybe they don't present as having learned it as children, but once you become an adult, you remember those lessons. But I understand so well now, when I entered my 20s and 30s, I really came to appreciate all that he had attempted to teach us. Children don't always represent us in the manner that we've trained them, but we tried, and I think we did pretty good. All 6 of us did graduate from college, high school and college. And I think that was quite an accomplishment at that time. However, my mother, being the oldest of 5 girls, all 5 of those girls, think about how old, if my mother were living today, she would be about 105. But all 5 of them finished college at an HBCU at a time when many of us didn't know what an HBCU was. So, my grandfather was always very proud, and it set a standard for the rest of the family. So I think my father had it in his head that, well, 6 is just one more than 5. And if he could do it with as little as they had, then my father, I think, felt he could certainly do it, but he owed it to us because he knew there wasn't going to be a lot of good things waiting if we weren't prepared, for the world that we were facing.
Well, only thing I want to say about that is that I would love to see us go back to those days. Like I think the baby boomers, we all wanted to do things differently and coddle the kids a little bit more and so forth. But Kalon, I'm expecting your generation to kind of go back to basics.
Right now, we trying. I mean, I think we need to go back and have these conversations. And that's why I think this conversation is important to understand, the importance of the discipline and the consistency. The world that we have around us today, the systems that are in place, were not built for us. So to be able to go through life and accomplish these things, and not only that, but to pass it down to your children and ensure that they have a path to get to the things that they want to. I can't imagine what it was like during the civil rights movement to live in that moment and still be able to maintain such a a progressing family. So testament to your father. I want to take a moment just to, thank him for his service and everything that he's done. Honestly, to hear that is just really inspirational.
If you could speak to the influence that his leadership had on you and how that molded you into, your lifetime commitment to social justice, unity, and reconciliation.
I'm going to change your question just a tad bit. I think my father set the stage for excellence, for order, for timeliness. All of those things are very important. But if you have tremendous other skills and you don't have a respect for order and timeliness and integrity, sometimes it still doesn't work well for you. So what I want to say is that I think my passion for community service and for working in the communities came from my grandparents. My grandfather was the person in the community, in his community, who, if someone had been arrested, he was the person that was called. If someone had died in a household, not only the services of a pastor, but the lament and the prayers of a pastor, he would just go and minister to that family. He was the person that I followed around in the summers to all of these emergencies. What we also did, every 2 weeks, we would travel to a community, a lot of little towns that you may never have heard of, Notasulga, Thorsby, Jemison, Alabama. We would spend 2 weeks doing vacation Bible school in those places. Most of those places did not have a pastor, could not afford a pastor. But we would go there anyway and do 2 weeks of vacation Bible school. And my grandmother would say, okay, you're responsible for passing out the Bibles and you're responsible for keeping the supplies in order, or that type of thing. I remember them coming to him when someone had been arrested. And so just think about all of this time that I traveled around with them in the summer. And there were always lots of children in these environments. So I liked meeting the children. I liked traveling with them. But I learned a lot of the administrative things that I would later do at 16th Street Church. I learned a lot of that from my grandparents. For example, as Vanessa stated, I was the Sunday school secretary, but we also started a library because during those years, Black people couldn't use the public libraries. My passion for people and for supporting and community service, and a lot of that based on what I saw my grandfather do. And I always could tell how much they appreciated someone coming in, whatever the need was, even if you couldn't feel the need, the fact that you came and gave them a hug and said, it's going to work out, it's going to be okay.
And nothing more precious and special than those times with our grandparents. And
that's right.
Yeah, they just have a different way of parenting and nurturing and so forth than our parents. Or it may not even be that they have a different way, it's that we receive it so much differently than we do typically from the parents. So parent, that's incredibly special. Can you talk about how you got involved with the civil rights movement?
It was not intentional. My involvement with it was not intentional. I'll start with when I entered the 9th grade, my high school, A.H. Parker High School, was not far from the church. Sometimes after school, I would be asked to volunteer, come and answer the phones if the secretary was out, or do letters or whatever. And so this particular day, when they had the very first mass meeting at 16th Street Church, I didn't know about the meeting, but I had been asked to come and sit in the office, answer the phone, greet guests. 16th Street was the very first Black Baptist church built in Birmingham. Almost any noteworthy Black person that you could mention, if they came to Birmingham, they came to 16th Street Baptist Church. In later years, we would be speaking about people like Rosa Parks or Martin King or Andrew Young or any of them. But this particular day, I went to the church. I was working in the office. It was after school. And I noticed I came in the back door and I heard the singing in the sanctuary. And it just sounded very strong, very powerful. So I went to the door and I peeked inside. And to my surprise, the church was filled with young people. In those years, we would tell people that the church held 1,800 people. Today, we tell them 1,400. But just imagine 1,800 children, all of the seats on the floor, the main floor were filled. All of the seats in the balcony were filled. And then there were children just sitting in the aisles on the floor. I really didn't know what was going on, but I felt the energy. Young people just generate energy just by being in the room. And so I felt the energy and I thought, I wonder what's going on. It just looked exciting. And I recognized a few of them from school. I recognized a few of them from my neighborhood. So I closed up the office. I went out and took a seat in the church, and I wanted to see what was going on. And I felt it was okay because these were all young people. They appeared to be ages from, I would say, 10 years old through high school. Well, when I went out and took a seat and I looked up at the pulpit, there were 6 men sitting on the pulpit. Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the men, Reverend Andrew Young, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Reverend James Bevel. Did I say Shuttlesworth? Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth?
Oh, yeah,
That's
okay.
the last one.
Yeah. Okay. So these 6 men were sitting on the pulpit. I knew who they were, but as a kid, that wasn't a big deal to me because we saw these people. Reverend Shuttlesworth lived in Birmingham. And we knew Reverend Shuttlesworth from 1954 when we had the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Reverend Shuttlesworth had 3 daughters, and he had been trying to enroll those 3 daughters in the high school since 1954. And this meeting, we're now April 1963, and Reverend Shuttlesworth tells the story, or told the story, that Martin King had been working in Albany, Georgia, and when the work was finished, he sent him a letter December of '62, and he said, we sure could use your help here in Birmingham. If you're amenable to this idea, please come to Birmingham. So Dr. King came to Birmingham. He was there at Shuttlesworth's request. Think about that. Brown v. Board, 1954, but it's 1963 now in April, and we're still as segregated as ever. Each one of those men gave a speech. Reverend Shuttlesworth said, we aim to kill segregation or be killed by it. Dr. King talked about man's law versus God's law. James Bevel was brought in from Nashville. His job was to find young students that were already showing leadership capabilities. So James Bevel started with the captain of the football team, for example, the president of the student council, the president of the science club, or depending on what was at your school, he went looking for those leaders, and all of those people were recruited to come to the meeting, and then they were used to recruit other children. Once they had been instructed and trained, all of us, they were used to recruit other children. So Bevel is sort of explaining the plan, and he and Reverend Shuttlesworth are saying, we need you to know certain things. If you march, you may be arrested. Policemen may have billy clubs. They may have dogs. They may push you. They may spit on you. They were trying to warn us. The most important aspect of marching is maintaining the integrity of the non-violence philosophy. If you cannot be non-violent, you were asked to step aside.
And I have to be real right now, with everything that was going up against y'all during these marches, how are you able to maintain this? And what was the feeling before you went out for that march? And they're telling you that you may be hosed, dogs may attack you, people will be talking down on you, spitting at you. What is the feeling to say, okay, I know all of this right now, and I'm going to still go out and march. I'm still going to step out on what I believe in. And then not only that, and not be violent when these things happen.
I don't think that it fazed us very much. People can tell you about things, but until you experience them yourself, you know, I had, at one point, I had never flown in a plane. So someone could share that experience, but until you actually fly, you probably want to fly. And in our cases, we wanted to support Birmingham. We knew what it meant. We understood what segregation meant.
Mhm.
And as Dr. King was talking about man's law and God's law, here are the three things that went through my mind. Number one, when my grandmother came to Birmingham, my grandfather brought her there one day. She was really very sick. And we learned that hospitals didn't take Black patients. You know, I'm talking about laws now. So as they were talking, I began to reflect in my own mind how those laws had already impacted me. My grandmother died in the basement of this hospital. I sat there with her for 2 weeks because my mom didn't want to leave her there. They wouldn't put her in a room. And it was a real basement with the pipes around the wall and the bricks and things. So I had to sit there in case of an emergency. I was 10 years old. My grandma, you know, so I'm remembering, as Dr. King is talking, I'm remembering my grandmother. Then as Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth comes up and talks about the kids not being admitted to the school, I'm remembering that in the 8th grade, I had won the Alabama statewide spelling competition. Normally what happens, you compete in the city, the county, and the winners go to the state. And after the state, you would normally go to the national.
National, sure.
Right, but I was told that Black children were not allowed to participate in the national competition. So as Dr. King is talking, I'm remembering these experiences. I'm also remembering that George Wallace has just recently made his famous stand in the doorway, University of Alabama. You guys remember that speech? Not today, not tomorrow, or ever.
Oh, yes.
No Blacks attend this university. So these are the things that were going through my mind. Prior to actually sitting in that meeting, I had had these experiences, but it never made me feel like I wanted to march or do anything. I just was very sad when my grandmother died, you know?
Yeah.
But as I listened to them, I thought to myself, okay, so this is wrong. This is not just the way it is, you know? And they were presenting to the young people a way to attempt to change it. And I wanted to be a part of that. So, and Reverend Shuttlesworth said, the goal of this march is not to be a winner. The goal of this march is reconciliation. Everything that we're trying to do in the city of Birmingham, we want to win, or we want the winner to be reconciliation. So this is sort of how I came to be. It wasn't something I really thought about. I was aware of it, but gosh, as strict as my father was, there was no way I would have made that decision on my own. But the power of the moment with all of these young people and the singing, remember those songs that you see, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around? We would just stand and stomp and clap and sing those songs before we actually went out. And you were just very inspired to go out and, you know, not really knowing what was going to happen, but understanding deep in your heart, in your spirit, you were really trying to make a difference. You were trying to show the evils of segregation and to allow the city to see how unfair this was. We were fairly sheltered in the sense we didn't know about a lot about lynchings and a lot of other things that were going on during that time. They did not talk about these things. So there was a lot that we weren't aware of, but I think our parents were. And I think my father was really, really upset with me, so.
That because of the understanding the lynchings and just the danger that you were putting yourself in by.
That's right.
So yeah, so he was not happy about it because he understood like what that could mean, which is basically understandable considering that the church was bombed. So if you could just talk about like that day.
So the first thing, when I'm talking about the church, the first thing I like to say is that at the time of the church bombing, there were already 60 unsolved bombings.
There were 60 unsolved. I wanted to make sure I heard this right.
60. In Birmingham.
In Birmingham alone, just
In
Birmingham.
Birmingham, just Birmingham, there were already recorded 60.
660.
Right. The first
Oh.
bomb exploded in 1948 when someone either accidentally or intentionally sold a home to a Black person that crossed the imaginary dividing line in Birmingham. You know, whites lived on one part of the city, Blacks lived on the other part. And from that point on, bombings were used to intimidate, to remind people that we were a segregated city. So I like for people to know the 16th Street Church bombing is the only one where people were killed. But Reverend Shuttlesworth's house, for example, had been bombed 3 times already when the 16th Street Church was bombed. The A.G. Gaston Motel, which was the one Black motel that we had, built for people like Dr. King and those when they came to town so that they would have somewhere to stay. The A.G. Gaston Motel was bombed. The home of Dr. King's brother, A.D. King, was bombed. So here we have 60. There were always Black churches, Black homes, and Black businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So on September 15th, we arrived at church, and at 9:30, I arrived at 9:30 in time for Sunday school. And I just went and picked up my reports and the offering envelopes and passed these things out. And then I would sit in my class until it was time to collect it. Then I would get up, leave my class about 10:15, collect all of that and summarize it. So this Sunday was no different. Well, it was different in one or two ways. One, it was Youth Day, and all of the youth were on program. We each had a role to play in the 11 o'clock service. Our lesson for that morning for Sunday school was a love that forgives, from the text of Luke. And the pastor had placed on the marquee out front the title of his sermon, which was also a love that forgives. So as I collected everything downstairs, you had to walk past the women's bathroom, which is where the girls were. And I paused to say good morning to them, one, because it was Youth Sunday, but also to say that we needed to hurry and be upstairs. They should have been in class. The other thing, one of the girls, Cynthia Wesley, we were in a club together. So we had a club meeting scheduled at 3 o'clock. And the one Black newspaper had allowed us to put an article in the paper about it. And we were just really excited about that article, that everybody saw our name in the paper, So I said, we need to hurry. I just spoke to them, and I was carrying all of this stuff. So I hurried past them and went upstairs. Well, let me also say that Cynthia Wesley's father was my grade school principal, grades 1 through 8. He was my principal when I won the spelling competition. After the girls were killed, he would come to me in later years and ask if I would be the youth representative, spokesperson for that anytime someone approached the church about what had happened on that Sunday. So these were not random people. I had known Dr. Claude Wesley all of my life. Denise McNair, the 11-year-old's father, was my 9th grade school teacher. He was one of only 2 Black photographers we had in town. If you needed pictures, you had to go to one of these 2 men. I'm just trying to paint a picture of how closely knit the community was. Mm-hmm. But getting back to the girls, I had passed the girls in the bathroom and gone upstairs. The phone was ringing and the clerk had left the office. So I answered that phone, and the caller on the other end said 3 minutes and quickly hung up. So I'm still holding those materials. I just hang up the phone. I walk out into the sanctuary, which at that point we didn't have carpet. We didn't have padded seats or anything. So you could hear, if someone dropped a pencil, you could hear everything very loudly. But when I walked out into the sanctuary, I reached the very first row and the bomb exploded in the church. If you're facing the back of the church, it was right on my right side. It blew into the church on my right side. And then we heard screams and people scuffling, and many of us just hid under the pews. And then I could hear feet. I could hear people running. I could tell they had gotten up and they were trying to get out. So I had arrived at church with those 2 younger brothers. And when I ran outside, that was my first reaction, to look for those 2 younger brothers. It took a while for that. It would be about 2:30 later that day before I would know that my four friends had not made it out of the bathroom. It would be a little better than 2 months before I would know that there was actually a fifth girl in the bathroom. She was in the back part of the bathroom, which is a little different from the lounge. It was the where the bowls were, the toilets themselves and the face bowls and all. But it had its own entrance. Once you walked into the lounge, you could sit and talk. But if you went through another entrance, that's where this other person was. Her name was Sarah. She was 12 years old. And we think she probably survived that bombing because she was in the other part of the bathroom. She would be found later because after they had sort of taken the other girls out of the rubble, they heard someone calling and crying, but they couldn't see anyone. She was buried under the rubble. And so they would eventually bring her out. She would be hospitalized for 3 months before she was allowed to go home. Not many people even knew that she was there for a long time.
And she lost sight in one of her eyes as a result.
That's correct, Vanessa. She lost sight in one eye, and today I'm told that she has 30% vision in the other eye.
That's my first time hearing this story in such grave detail. I appreciate you sharing it. That's a lot to take in.
And
yeah, it was a lot to live with at home.
Even for you, yeah.
And what I remind people, we were living in the day of no counselors. Not one single time did we ever discuss this. Well, this was Sunday morning. The bomb exploded at 10:22. 8 o'clock Monday morning, we were all in school again. There was no moment of silent prayer. There was no discussion in the classroom, or does anybody want to say anything? There was none of that. In my home, there was nothing. The only persons I ever spoke to, the FBI, came to the house twice. And if you were in the church at that morning, there were 75 of us that were there at that point. You were interviewed, if you were at least 12 years old, you were interviewed by the FBI. We all still have FBI testimony on file. You could actually go and read it and look at it and see what I was saying about that morning when we came in. But other than talking to the FBI, no one talked about it at all. Even my parents, no one said, "Are you okay? Are you afraid?" Because I really was afraid after the bombing, and no one was arrested. No one was taken to justice. Do you want to talk about your friends? Nothing. Just nothing.
Everybody kind of went back to their normals.
We went back to
normal like routines, essentially, right?
Went back to school. We were out of the church for 8 months until they renovated it. And when we went back in, there was no memorial ceremony. There was no classroom with someone's name now on it.
Nothing.
That's what I
expected.
To
remember that.
Nothing.
Right.
Yeah, nothing.
Man.
Like they wanted it to go away. But remember what I said now, there had been over 60 unsolved bombings. So we had gotten accustomed, I hate to say that we had become accustomed to the bombs, but when we could hear every bomb that went off. Birmingham was small, and you could hear it every time one exploded. And everybody would look at each other, and then we would just sit there and wait, because we knew the phone was going to ring, and someone would say they just bombed the home of attorney Arthur Shores. No one was hurt. And that was really what you were waiting to hear. No one was hurt. The 16th Street Church bombing is the only one where people were killed.
Historically, the trauma that we experience in our community is often so devastating that the families and the communities just don't know what to do. They don't know how to handle it. They don't know how to really talk about it. And so they basically focus on the survival aspect, like what do we need to do to survive and to keep our families intact. But as you had such a traumatic experience, firsthand experience, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, losing 4 close friends, can you just talk about your experience with trauma, how that traumatically impacted you, And then what was your journey in overcoming that trauma, as well as just the day-to-day kinds of ways that you had to navigate the racism and oppression that you experienced in Birmingham?
So I have to mention one more bombing. April 1964, they bombed the house across the street from where I was sleeping. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. And we were once again awakened, the sound of all the glass shattering in the house and this horrible noise. And then we heard these horrible screams. And so I mentioned that one because I think that particular bombing was more traumatic. This was after the death of the girls.
This
It
is
was-
7 months after?
It
if
was
I
in
read this
April of
right?
64. So
Oh,
yeah, that's
seven-
about 7
Oh,
or 8
7 months. Wow, this is quick, like back to back.
Right. And, you know, it was at that point, I think, Vanessa, that I think they began at that point. All of the unanswered questions I had, the depression, the not really wanting to be around people much anymore or talk much anymore. It really started after that. Because what it began to look like to me was is this going to be a way of life? Am I not safe anywhere? Why are they able to do this? And you know, I was just really confused and upset because no one was talking about it. At this time I was 15, and keeping in mind that no one had been arrested. This is 8 months later. Remember, it was 15 years before the first person was arrested, 15 years after the fact before the first person was arrested. So it was at this point I began to really have the sleepless nights. Loud noises bothered me. If someone popped a balloon at a birthday party, even if it was those big trucks that pass by and make those noises, you know, just anything would set me off. And I didn't realize what was going on with myself. I just knew that I was reacting a certain way. I had a rash on my hands that I couldn't get rid of. The only thing that ever made it feel better, went to a little party and someone offered me a drink. That was when I noticed that it felt better. You know, it's sort of like it blotted it out. It just went away for a little while. But then, you know, it came back, right? And so I kept thinking to myself, oh, this is how you get rid of it. This fear, this anxiety, this is how you get rid of it. But I learned that it kept coming back. You know, it wasn't the way to get rid of it. Even my husband suggested to me several times, he even suggested to me, I think you ought to talk to someone. This is something, my mother never asked me anything. She never said, are you okay? Do you want to talk about your friends? No one at the church, no one at the school. So this is how deep it was. This says it better than anything I can say. Last year, I got a call from Fisk University. I'm a graduate of Fisk University. This is where I went after high school. So the school calls and they said, you got a lot of classmates out there that are saying they've seen this book, they've seen these documentaries, and they're trying to understand why they never knew anything about this. They went to school with you for 4 years and you never said a word. So what she was also saying is they want to arrange a pilgrimage to Birmingham. They'd like to bring your classmates of 1969, but they want to bring anybody else that wants to know, how is it you can maneuver around here and do your schoolwork and be friends with everybody for 4 years and you never said anything? The only thing they noticed was that I was by myself a lot. I would sit under trees. I would sit in the dorm I like sitting on the floor, and I would sit and write things. I have a whole box, an entire box, shoebox of things that I wrote, poetry or prose during that time. And it's very dark. And if you read it, you'll see exactly where my head was. But it was a miserable time, Vanessa, for almost 20 years. My doctor said to me one day when he looked at that rash on my hands, he said, we're gonna have to figure out what's bothering you. I didn't think anything was bothering me. It took me a while for myself to know that I had really lost something. So there was no counseling Vanessa, during that time. I just did it the best I could. I winged it, so to speak, the best that I could.
You and I, we've had these conversations a few times, and
Mhm.
every time that, I have an opportunity to speak with you about it, I just learn even more. And just the impact of, such a traumatic experience, and especially not having anyone during that time to talk about it, it just kind of exasperates. And we do have to just exasperate the trauma, and then we have to be on our own and figuring out how to survive it and how to navigate through it. I'm just so grateful that you did figure it out, or you're still figuring it out. I think that all of us here, even on this panel discussion, we've had different levels of trauma, nothing to that degree, for sure, but different levels of trauma. And just being able to do what we need to do, the hard work of figuring it out. But the situation is that it never completely goes away. There's always that kind of like lingering reality of any type of trauma that you experience. And a lot of people think that, you can kind of do the hard work and it will go away, but typically it does not go away. In many ways, it's good that it doesn't go away, because it keeps us like committed to the journey, and it keeps us committed to supporting, other people, and to sharing our story so that other people can learn from that, and also to know that they're not alone in their trauma. And more importantly, there's so much trauma going on, in our society, and our communities are still not skilled in talking about it or aware of resources that are available. So can you speak to that, just in terms of recommendations based on your experience of how important it is for families in our communities to deal with the mental health issues in our community, because people are dealing with different levels of traumatic experiences on an ongoing basis. I went to a conference many years ago, and it was a Christian conference, and one of the keynote speakers of that conference, she talked about some traumatic experience and generational trauma that she had experienced. And she likened it until like a clock, you set a clock on a wall, and the timing of your traumatic experience, it stays with you emotionally within the age of that experience trauma, particularly if that trauma was not like addressed or you didn't get the support. So emotionally, you stay in that state of emotional impact, relative to your age. So if your trauma, that you experienced at the 16th Street Baptist Church happened at 14, but you didn't start getting help until you were like in your 30s or your 40s, emotionally, you're still managing it at that 15-year-old level.
That's important.
It's amazing that you say that, Vanessa, because I would tell people when I wrote the book, I said, I'm trying to write it from the mind of the 14-year-old. But I also say in there that I felt like I stood still for 20 years. And I've never spoken to a psychiatrist. I wasn't reading psychiatric books, but I just felt like I was still at that place, even though I had gotten much older and I now had married and had 2 daughters. I felt like I stood still for 20 years because I was still trying to figure it out, trying to know what to do with this. I think possibly what helped me a lot, well, I know it helped a lot. I started talking about it. This is 25 years after the fact. USA Today calls me and they've decided now to revisit the bombing of the church 25 years later. They go and get that FBI list, and a lot of those people have died. I've lived in Atlanta, I've lived in Florida, but at this point, I just happened to be back in Birmingham. And so it started getting better when I did this interview with USA Today. It was a really long interview, and it made me rethink all the things that had happened and how long I had been traveling this journey. Then, as you know, Vanessa, we got a call from Oprah. I got a call from Oprah. And then it was just no stopping after those 3 people, USA Today, Oprah, and Mrs. Edelman, the world started calling. But it just went on. And as I would tell people sometimes now when I talk to them, I've been to 43 states now and 9 countries, all by invitation. And I can still get pretty sad when I think about it. And I sort of reached a point where I really didn't want to talk about it anymore. But God let me know that I needed to talk about it, not only for me, but for the rest of the world, so that we can understand what happens, what hatred does to people, the depths of the abyss to which people will go in the name of hatred. And so God put me on a path to reconciliation and forgiveness. I just started studying all of that, and it settled in my spirit so well that this is why I went back to school, ended up at Sanford, working on the divinity degree, and in later years would go up to New York Theological, which is next door to Union Theological, and then to actually get some fine tuning in the reconciliation aspect, what we need to do, how do we reconcile? Whenever people heard the word reconciliation, they always thought black and white. We're talking about biblical reconciliation. If we can accomplish that, we shouldn't even be concerned about what color or nationality or anything else, particulars about a person. We should just see them as a sister or a brother in God. And so, you know, I started with that, and everybody kept talking black and white. So I just did my own kind of a U-turn with it, because I really think that that is the way it should be. You know, we recognize the beauty of diversity. We appreciate it, we love it, but, you know, there's not going to be diversity in heaven, I don't think. And if we haven't learned to like people who are different from us, if we haven't learned to appreciate and to live with people who are different, we're going to have a lot of challenges. So, sorry.
I agree. No, and that's where the United States and the world is at today. We got a long ways to go until we reach that reconciliation point. What are some, you know, call to actions that you think communities or people that are watching this can do to start moving towards that goal and moving towards, you know, what this could look like in the future, you know, to shorten this curve for us?
You know, for anyone that would be listening right now, I would say, let's start with small steps. It can be as simple as being a church that's different from yours. You know, we have a lot of different denominations in the country. It can be as simple as just learning about other people, you know.
Right.
It can be as simple as even communities sharing an event, a picnic, or a program, you know, just stepping out in some way. I have gone to schools and said, I'd like to leave a couple books in your library. Or I've gone to schools and said, I'll be happy to talk to your students during the month of Black History. I just volunteered, you know, something along that line. So, because there's still a lot of young people in Birmingham that don't know. But I also volunteer for things. We get a lot of groups that will come to Birmingham, period. But I think it's very important for us to share these experiences, to share the pain and the hurt that has come with those. But I think it's also important to share what we see as a way forward, as a way to overcome all of the pain and so forth. No answer is wrong. No answer is incorrect. Whatever your spirit leads you in terms of reaching out to other people. I think I mentioned at the beginning of this call that Birmingham is having an Imagining Peace conference.
Yes.
At one point, when Nelson Mandela was still living, he came to Birmingham. In later years, F.W. de Klerk came and did sort of a panel with Reverend Shuttlesworth. You know, people who have lived through that period of time. We are very fortunate now. I'm older than all of you, I think, but I have the privilege of having been born at a time when segregation was at its worst, the lynchings and so forth. But I watched us move to integration. I watched us move to what actually appeared to me to be a fairly pleasant period of time. And then I watched us begin to spiral down again.
Back again.
And so we all have to run very fast to stop the spiral and to do whatever we can to keep moving in the right direction. So
there was a statement that you made in regard to moving how your spirit leads. And I think that is an incredible fact that is so important. I think that people have kind of moved away from letting their spirit lead and guide them in that space out of fear or out of lack of understanding, but not recognizing that sense there. And I'll even go as far as to use the word discernment, right? The importance of moving and acting in that space, because sometimes you may be discerning that this one act of love, this one act of extension of the olive branch, this one act of being concerned with someone other than self will be the very thing that's necessary to kind of tip the scales for someone in the direction of reconciliation, in the direction of love and appreciation, in the direction somewhere other than what they've seen. And I think that that statement that you made, it was very, very important and powerful, so much more that I was absolutely listening to what you had to say, but that resonated so heavily with me, because unfortunately, we've come to a place now where within our generation that we're seeing, I hate to say the word unnecessary, but in some instances, an unnecessary spiral. It does not have to be this way.
That's right.
It doesn't have to. It's a choice in some instances.
It is a choice. It is a choice every day. And actually, there was a song that we sang during the movement. It said, "I'm gonna do what the Spirit says do. I'm gonna do what the Spirit says do. If the Spirit says move, then move, I will. I'm gonna do what the Spirit says do. If the Spirit says sing, then sing I will. I'm gonna sing when the Spirit says sing." That song was written by Dorothy Cotton, one of the few females that was in Dr. King's close circle, but she was also one of the trainers in Birmingham. And as you all know, songs were a very important part of everything that was done. But I thought about it, we sang the song, but it is an important message that you just gave us. Move when the Spirit says move. Do what the Spirit says do. And we very much operated that way. If you're led to be kind or to help someone who may need some help, then you should, just do that.
Yeah.
I think our stance, our presentation, Vanessa, how we present ourselves to people, as thoughtful, as loving. Aren't you always amazed at how loving and how resilient our folk are when you look at all that has happened? They still present with beautiful attitudes. They still present, like all of you, doing beautiful work with so much concern, still in their heart, so much love still in the heart. And if you can live without allowing someone else to destroy that, then you can be successful wherever you are. I think I was just too young. I didn't know quite what to do with that, but I understand it now more than ever. And that's just such a perfect caption for this entire conversation, Ashlie. Do what the Spirit says do. The Holy Spirit doesn't lead us wrong. Our spirits generally don't lead us
I
wrong.
absolutely love that. 100%.
I think that when we talk about hate and the cost of hate, like in our world, if we succumbed to that hate ourselves, then spiritually we die along with the haters. And hating is a form of death. And I don't think that a lot of people recognize that. And so when we think about your journey and your experiences, then, for many people, the common reaction to that would be to hate back. But we don't find life in any way when we retaliate with hate. But, when we actually transform that hate into love, into reconciliation, and that is how we continue to have impact in the world. And people don't understand when we reach that point in our lives where, yet you slay me, though I will love you, because it's the only path forward.
That's right. We're working toward what Dr. King called the beloved community.
Right.
The period in time when we all have value, when we're all loved and appreciated for who we are and for the gifts that we've been given. But the prophet Isaiah speaks of it as a time when lambs walk with wolves, when lambs walk with lions, and where children lead us. Children will be able to lead us because the world is full of the love and full of the knowledge of the holy. So this is what we work toward. We do all things to make the world better. If what I'm doing is not going to improve something, someone, somehow, then maybe I need to rethink that. But just to continue working, loving, as you say, and not hating, not even allowing that to enter in our space at all.
And it doesn't mean that we condone hate.
That's right.
It doesn't mean that we accept it. It
That's
means
right.
that we basically are choosing a different path forward.
That's right. That's
Mhm.
right.
Because again, that goes
Right.
back to the point of it being a choice.
That's
That's
right.
what I was just gonna say, Ashley. It's
Every day.
always a choice. It's always a choice.
Every day.
Right. And we challenge it through love.
Yeah.
Here we
Yeah.
go.
Dr.
There we
McKinstry, this has been wonderful. And I don't know if there are things that you would like to discuss that we may not have asked, or Ashlie and Kalon, if there are other things that you have on your mind, because there's so much and so many things that were revealed to me in your book, because
Mhm.
like I always knew about the 16th Street Baptist Church, but prior to meeting you and learning about the constant bombings in Birmingham, and that there were actually 60 prior to the 16th Street the 16th Street bombing, I was absolutely shocked because we never heard about any of that in our history. It was always the 16th Street Baptist Church, the 4 little girls who were killed in that bomb. So this is enlightening to us, but also enlightening to all of our viewers. And it's been such a pleasure, but I just want to make sure that we don't miss anything. And if there are things that we have missed that you think are critical to share, can you do that now?
Thinking in terms of some of the things that we did not get to, the first thing I would say, and I'll make this one really short. I have a book, and the title of it is Disciplines of the Spirit. And it's written by Howard Thurman. But Howard Thurman says we have to discipline ourselves to love. We have to discipline ourselves to forgive. We have to discipline ourselves to be reconcilers. And we have to discipline ourselves to be just all things good. It requires an inner discipline. You have to practice this just as you would a speech. I think just practicing it, I think, is the best way that I can say it, but it's something we work at. Generally, we're not just born with these beautiful character traits. We have to work, and a lot of the work comes because of things that happen to us. Someone says something that really hurts, and I think to myself, gosh, I would never say that to someone, or I will never say that to anyone. So just disciplining ourselves to love people. They don't have to look like us. They don't have to think as we do or dress as we do. We love them because by one God, we were all created, and we're all created in the same image. You know, there was a time when I really didn't like the word diversity. I didn't like Southern Poverty Law Center's word either. They used the word tolerance, teaching tolerance. But who are we, Vanessa, to tolerate anyone? Who are we to not like diversity? We didn't create anything. Diversity was here at the very beginning. It was not created by us. We have no capability to create anything as any human being. But it can show you sometimes just how full of ourselves people can be, just thinking that they actually get to pass judgment on people because of whatever, their colors, their training, their origin, their religion, or any other preferences. And so I'm learning every day to accept every human being I meet is part of God's creation. None of us have the capability of creating anything. One of the projects that I worked on, the Southern Rural Women's Project, the project of nothing but women, but it was the first time that I actually saw women just loving each other and helping. Didn't matter what type of assistance you needed, but they continue to do a phenomenal job. I started working with them in the year 2000. It was an initiative, a Ford-funded initiative, but it was started by the Children's Defense Fund. You remember I told you they kept asking me to come to the Alex Haley Farm?
I do.
So
I do.
after I did that, when I got home, what do we call it? Federal Express envelope, waiting on my porch, and it had 2 plane tickets in it. This is when we were still getting plane tickets to come to Washington, D.C. And it was from Mrs. Elliman again. And I was like, oh my God, you know what? How do we get away from these people?
He didn't give you an out that time. She said,
No,
here's
I
the
mean,
ticket.
I felt
You
like I
sent
was
the
being
ticket,
put
you
on the
gotta go
spot.
now.
Yeah, I just kept feeling like people were putting me on the spot. I don't want to talk to anybody else about, you know, I did it. Can you just leave me alone? This is really how I felt about it. But when I went, she invited me to Washington. When I got there, she said, I wanted you, I'm having my national meeting here. She said, I wanted you to tell the story that you told at the farm in Tennessee. Once I arrived in Washington, D.C., I'm thinking about it. The janitor came up to me while I was sitting there and he said, may I help you? I said, well, I'm going to be on the program. I thought I'd just look around. And he said, well, here's a program. And when I looked at the program, I saw my name on the program. But when I was being introduced by Taylor Branch, and I just got sick inside. I just asked him, was there a ladies' room? I started throwing up because I was the morning speaker, the breakfast speaker, being introduced by Taylor Branch. The luncheon speaker was Maya Angelou.
Oh.
And I just felt like I was gonna die. I said, somebody.
What did you say to yourself to
Well,
get
no,
you
I
back?
thought they had made a mistake. I said, she's got me
Something
confused
gotta
with
be wrong.
somebody. And I was throwing up, and then I just started crying. And the janitor said, well, I don't know what the conversation was, but it appears that somebody's depending on you to
to do this thing.
Yeah, so I spoke that morning. I said, okay, girl, you got to get yourself together. And I just went and I prayed. Lord, help me tell this story in a way that is beneficial to them, that is a blessing to them, that inspires them. After that was over, and then after I sat through the luncheon thing, I noticed that my plane ticket it started on a Monday, so I came up on a Sunday, but I couldn't go back home till Friday because my ticket was not ticketed until Friday. And I thought to myself, I said, well, I told her, I said, I think there's a mistake because I'm on this ticket. This is for Friday. And she said, come on. And she took my arm and walked me down the hall. And when I walked into this room, Vanessa, and Ashlie, there were about 30 women there in that room. This was the beginning of the Southern Rural Women's Initiative. And she sort of tricked me into, and they were from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. And this was a Southern Rural Women's Initiative for those 3 states. Those states were chosen because they're the poorest states in the country. And the women were brought together because women are the poorest people in those 3 states. And so the idea was that we would go into each one of those states as a group and find ways to bring the women together, organize for change. But we created what we call the Mayor's Commission on Women. And we started bringing those very rural women together so they could learn from each other, so they could learn from us. And this organization had resources enough that if the women said, we'd like to have a conference, Vanessa, so you can come and talk to us about the important things we need to do, they had resources where they could call a meeting of all the mayors in those 3 states, just the women, and we might choose Vanessa's hometown, and she would set the agenda and say, here are the issues in my town.
And it's important to always position yourself to be available to be a conduit for someone else, right? You never, ever know who you're called to serve and how you're called to serve. So you just have to be open and you have to be willing to be a vessel. And I think that just during the course of this conversation, like you've talked about that in so many different ways and the importance of it and how you've positioned yourself, even in your youth, right? To be a conduit and to identify in some instances the unspoken need and feel that just a short time ago talking about the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative, even though you all were bringing those young women in, busing them in, and you all were meeting with women in rural spaces for one particular thing, you guys were identifying unspoken needs, which you were able to serve that. And some of the exterior things, not saying that those weren't important because they were equally just as important, but they were sometimes a symptom of something else.
That's right. Yeah.
So being able to
Right.
identify and serve the unspoken need, that's important. And I think that, you know, your willingness to position yourself to be a conduit of information, conduit of resource, conduit of love, you know, you're shifting lives in ways, and not even just the individual person. We're talking about a legacy shift here, all because there was the one that was introduced to the opportunity to be the something different.
I mean, I think that's true of all of our people. We have roles to play. We're mentors wherever we are. You know, and as we might say, if we were in the church arena, we're never uncalled, right? So Vanessa, you're never uncalled. Ashlie, you're never uncalled. It doesn't matter, Kalon, what your job title is today. There's still work for you to do. It may not have a name. You may not have gotten there yet, but you'll find this out, that until you draw your last breath, you're never uncalled. Someone needs what you have. Most of all, I think they need that spirit that we have of continuing to be resilient and pressing forward no matter what it looks like. We walk by faith, right? We walk by our strength and our resilience and the God that has carried us this far. So we just always have a job to do. That's the point. So I'm actually talking to you guys now that you're never uncalled. There's a lot more work. I can tell you that, because I try to tell them, I said, well, when do we get to sit down? You know, do you guys know how old I am? You know, yeah, we know. We love you because you're that age.
Yes.
And here's the assignment that they've put together for you. You know, so I look forward to hearing continuously, Vanessa, what you're doing, what Ashley's doing, what Kalon is doing. Our young people are so fortunate to have you doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.
I totally 100% agree. And
That
I
means a
love
lot.
that about Dr. McKinstry. And she knows that the struggle is real and sometimes it gets hard and we want to disengage. So we do want to go and take a seat. But one of the things that she has really blessed me with is constantly reminding me is, no, you don't get to sit down. People, Dr. McKinstry, in closing, I kind of want to go back because the Grand Rapids African American Health Institute, our focus is on health equity in the African American community. And when I think about, you know, your experience with your grandmother, and you were a chaplain, you know, within a particular hospital setting and so forth, and you saw a lot of things going on in areas of disparities for African American communities and other unrepresented communities. And so just in closing, can you speak just about anything that you would recommend in terms of things that we can do to address these health disparities in the 21st century here in 2023? So just based on your experience, what have you seen that has worked, and what kinds of things do you think that still needs to be done to improve health inequities within vulnerable populations?
Well, unfortunately, Vanessa, when I was working at the hospital as a chaplain, I went back to that hospital because I watched my grandmother die there. Every time I would go in that direction or get near that hospital, my heart would just start sort of beating fast. And I wanted to get past that, whatever it was. I didn't know what it was. So I went to work over there, and I saw Black doctors that didn't want to wait on white patients. And I saw white doctors that didn't want to wait on Black patients. And I saw white patients who didn't want Black chaplains to pray for them. I said to myself, I can't believe that this is still so in front of us, and that is in the hospital where people go to get well. You mentioned the hospital, but I mentioned it from the standpoint is what you already said, Vanessa. Any situation that you encounter, it's not an accident that you've encountered this situation. I've looked back over so many things in my life, and I should write a book called Be on Guard, Be Aware, that so much of what happens to us is ordained. You know, it was meant to happen. This is your signal. This is your signal now to go and get involved in this. And we have to see everything that way. You know, before Dr. King passed away, what he said to us was the last horizon is the economic horizon. I've seen all kinds of women's groups and women entrepreneurs during this period of COVID. And I've heard statistically that more businesses and organizations were formed in the last 2 years of COVID, 2021, 22, than in the history of our time in this country. That's quite a statistic.
More of which have been started by Black women.
Black women, that's who they're talking about.
Yeah.
Black women have started more businesses in the last 2 years than they have in the whole history of Black people being in America.
Mhm.
And they continue, there are all kinds of young women that need our guidance, young men as well. And you just have to just be open to situations that you encounter. Go to the schools, talk to them about what you offer. Do you have interns in your program? Find internships in other programs. The need is so great in our communities. The need is so great. But if we can sort of bridge the gap a little bit economically, we likely can move into some other areas. We won't be so concerned about day-to-day things like eating,
Mhm.
medical care.
Sure.
You know, there are some very basic needs that consume the life of people every day. They don't have time to do other things, look for jobs or work almost anywhere, just because those other needs have never been met. But if you move into their arenas or bring them into yours, you'll see. God will show you the things that are needed there. And they will even begin to talk. They'll look at you and they'll see, well, she's very confident. She's very knowledgeable about this. I like the way she does these things. And she keeps talking about working over at that place. And they'll just listen and watch. Some of our children are very limited. There's a school that I would volunteer in sometimes where the principal told me one day, he said, the only professional person they've ever seen is a preacher. And when he came in, what they noticed the most was that he wore a tie. But they didn't know how to ask questions. They didn't know really what his role was. So I took a whole year, took a calendar and found somebody 5 days a week that would go speak at the school. So if you had come, Vanessa, you would have gone on Monday to talk about your work then. And if I was still doing the program, you'd talk about your work today. If you were a cashier, I brought you in. If you were a salesperson in a store, a teller in a bank, because these children had never heard of what is a teller?
Right.
Why do you go to the bank? I mean, these are simple things, but this is how restricted their exposure was to things. And so we know you can learn if you're given the opportunity. So yeah, we just have to, sometimes we have to search them out. But if you listen carefully, you'll hear them.
I have one question as we close out. My question is, over all of the work that you've been a part of, over all of the things that you've seen over your life, what is one of your most proudest memories or moments that you were a part of?
I think there might be two of those. The first one would be during the time that I served on the board at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. I had an opportunity to learn so much already about civil rights, and we worked with the Smithsonian in Washington. I worked with the Committee on Conscience.
Okay.
Conscience. Yeah, and I just learned a lot about the United States, the wars and things. It filled in a lot of gaps for me about the country and things we don't normally understand if we haven't had an opportunity.
Actually went through that process.
Right. So just serving on the board of an institution like the Civil Rights Institute, I also served for about 5 of those years with Reverend Shuttlesworth. So I got to know him really well. The other thing, I guess, would have to be the Southern Rural Women's Project. That organization is still working. And those women bring in their daughters and their daughters' friends, and they keep right on working. They have a succession plan. You know, when they just get too old or too sick to work, they can go home. They've already begun training the next group of people to come.
The next group of people coming.
Yeah, I mean, and they do
That's nice.
they do a lot of things. They sew, they garden, they've learned how to come together, bring the resources together so they get more for for the work that they've done. I think the greatest thing we've learned in all of that is just the support we can get from each other, no matter what the project is. You know, you can bring in a person that's totally stranger to your project, but they still have sometimes things you wouldn't have thought of, ideas that you wouldn't have thought of.
I think that conversation piece, kind of how we're doing now, just in regards to the community, it starts with just telling your story and being able to connect through that process. And that's kind of what I've been reassured through this conversation that we even having today, is to make sure that we connect and go into these connections leading with love.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate
Well, I
that.
fully expect for you guys to call me one day and say, hey, can you speak to Vanessa? She's got us all over the United States
Hey,
or something.
we got your phone. We got your phone number now. Dr. McKinstry, we'll be
You say,
calling you.
can you
for some
call me when we
advice.
hang up, right? Some advisement.
This work is too important to stay here.
100%.
It's very important. You're right. It's very important. I'm just thrilled to know about your work. I did some reading before we did the call this morning, but thank you so much for the invitation to just share. There's lots of work out there. You know that yourselves, lots of work for everyone, but thank you for allowing me to share that. And any way I can support, she knows she's going to call me, even if it's something out in left field that I can't do, she's probably going to call me anyway. We thank you for all that you do in the name of humanity. And this is what we need all of us to be doing. So thank you very much for all of that and for the invitation.
It's an honor.
Thank you for your kind words.
Yeah, the honor is definitely ours.
Same.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, we also want to thank Corewell Health, Genentech, Mercantile Bank, and Meyer Corporation for their ongoing support of GRAHI and our podcast, as well as our health education programming. And to all the viewers, we hope that this podcast is really meaningful and that there were numerous things that you could resonate with and that you can walk away from and learn from. But the main thing that we want to say is the work is not done. We're here to support the community, but we're also depending upon the community to support our community at large and making this world and our society and our communities a better place for everyone. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure meeting you, Dr. McKinstry, and I'm sure we'll be, talking soon.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine.
Thank you.
Take care, my friend.